September 15, 1916, in wooden hut on Cannock Chase, Staffordshire. A German private, 22 and hungry for months, wraps both hands around a steaming tin mug. The smell is not acorns or burnt barley, not the bitter substitute he has known since the winter. It is coffee. Real coffee. On the trestle beside him sits a heel of soft, pale bread that leaves white crumbs on the dark table. He does not speak. The guard at the end of the hut is counting heads, but his eyes say it. He did not think Britain, his enemy at sea and in the air, would start the day like this. The number that will follow him for the rest of his life is not his camp roll, not the date of his capture. It is the contrast. In one country, the bread is black and stretched with potatoes. In another, even prisoners begin the morning with white bread and a hot drink. Across the North Sea, a war of machines has become a war of mouths. Britain blockades, Germany substitutes. One side counts tons of wheat, the other counts turnips. By the end of 1914, captured Germans are crossing the Channel in regular convoys, some wounded, some dazed at how swiftly a battle ends when your line gives way. They arrive at docks behind barbed fences of rushed timber, shuffled into trains with canvas-covered windows, told in clipped English not to look out. They expect blows. They expect jeers. They expect the face of the enemy to be everything they have been taught, and then they are handed a tin of hot liquid and a wedge of bread, so white it looks like a lie. The map zooms out. Britain is an island that lives on imports. Grain from Canada and the United States, meat from Argentina, sugar from the Caribbean. In peacetime, it is abundance on a schedule that never fails. In wartime, it is a supply chain with a navy at both ends. The Royal Navy promises the flow will continue for the home front. It also promises to tighten the ring around Germany until ships stop coming. When they do, German kitchens turn to substitutes, ersatz, first in margarine, then in coffee, then in bread. The Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907 say prisoners must be fed and housed, protected from violence, allowed correspondence. They do not promise comfort. They do not promise coffee. But Britain faces a choice within those legal lines: adhere to the minimum or exceed it in a way that pays dividends of order. Food is not only sustenance in a camp, it is compliance. It is morale control by menu. By March 1915, the British system has settled into a pattern. Reception depots near ports, dispersal to inland camps, officers separated and treated differently, enlisted men assembled in great hutted compounds with latrine blocks, parade grounds, hospital tents that multiply with the influenza seasons, and cookhouses that become the beating heart of each wire-ringed world. The cookhouses have rules like any regiment: sugar locked in tins, bread counted, tea grounds weighed. The rhythm is predictable: roll call, drill, work parties, evening muster. In the gaps, the smell of hot drinks is a signal that the day keeps its shape. On a November morning, a newly arrived group from the Somme looks at the loaves cooling on racks by a brick oven. In Germany, white bread has been rationed and then replaced by a war bread, bulked out with potato, rye, even sawdust in rumor, if not in fact. Here, the dough is pale, soft, springing back under a finger. A corporal from Saxony stares at the crumb when he tears it. He doesn't eat right away. He touches it to be sure. The guard, who has been on night shift and cares little for theater, shrugs. "Go on," he says, and moves the line forward. White bread in a British camp is more than a kindness. It comes from a structure. Bulk flour contracts brokered by the War Office, millers requisitioned, bakers assigned, fuel scheduled to keep ovens hot. The coffee comes in sacks with dockside chalk marks, a chain from warehouse to camp store, that proves the blockade flows both ways: starvation outward, regularity inward. This is the moral paradox of maritime power. When the hand tightens on one coastline, it steadies the mug on another. The prisoner's first week passes in a sequence of astonishments. He learns that Sundays are quieter, that the Anglican chaplain will offer services, and German pastors will be allowed to gather their own flocks. He learns that letters home will be censored but permitted. He can write the word bread and the word coffee, but not the name of the guard who handed them to him. He learns the price of cigarettes in the canteen. He learns that when the camp siren sounds for a muster, you run, even if the bread is still warm. The numbers tell a steady story. By 1916, British camps hold tens of thousands of German prisoners scattered across England, Wales, and Scotland. Giant compounds like the ones on Cannock Chase are work engines in their own right. Every loaf that appears in a hut has passed through a ledger, and every ledger feeds a larger account that the state will settle after the armistice. There is a balance between duty and spite, between cost and control. Make the men hungry, and they will become unpredictable. Feed them fairly, and a camp runs on time. The contrasts sharpen by season. In the winter of 1916 to 1917, the so-called turnip winter ravages German cities. Coal is short, fat is scarce, bread shrinks. Mothers boil what they can. Children learn the name of hunger that lingers even after a meal. In Britain, rationing debates start and stop and then start again, but the camps keep their schedules. The German in the hut does not know the agricultural yields by county or which ships got through last month. He knows the weight of the bread he is handed. He knows the heat of the mug. He knows that his stomach, flat against his spine during the march to capture, has begun to release its hold. Eyewitness fragments slip through the mail. A blacksmith from Dusseldorf writes that he is surprised at the treatment, coffee in the morning, careful to avoid praising the enemy, careful to include complaints that will pass the censor. A reservist from Hamburg tells his wife that the bread is white here, adding a line about missing home to cover the shock she will feel. Some letters do not arrive. Some arrive months late, bearing news from an earlier self. But a theme slips through in ink between the lines. The enemy's bread tells a story our newspapers do not. A guard on kitchen duty watches the faces of new arrivals change. At first, suspicion, then calculation, then a steadying acceptance as they fold this new fact into their view of the world. The guard is not interested in compassion. He is interested in order. He knows how quickly a mess hall can turn if the ladle runs dry. He prefers full mugs for the same reason he prefers tight fencing staples. They keep the system intact. Work details leave the wire and files after breakfast. The men swing shovels on roads, lift timber in forestry gangs, pick stones in farm fields, drain ditches that make other fields arable again. The British economy is pulled taut by the demands of war. The POW is a strand stitched into national productivity. He is paid a token wage, sometimes in camp currency, sometimes in credits at the canteen. He spends it on tobacco, on razor blades, on an extra bun when they are available. The work warms him, but the coffee warms him first. The British system is not uniform. Some camps are clean, some are squalid. Some commandants interpret regulations with care, others with indifference. There are punishments for insolence, for attempted escape, for fighting. There are nights of cold in huts where the stove has run out of coal by 2 a.m. There is boredom like a film over every day. But the overall pattern holds. Feed the men, and the rest follows. Across the wires and water, German families clutch at rumors. Their sons write of bread and hot drinks. Can it be true? Newspapers tell them of British brutality or British decadence depending on the day's propaganda needs. The letters say something else. They are not love letters. They are not reports for a newspaper. They are inventories of experience, a bunk, a roll call, a loaf. By July 1917, the prisoner knows the layout of his camp like a small town. He knows which huts trade favors, which guards tolerate a longer smoke at the fence. He has watched men be moved to other compounds for medical reasons or for work assignments that need a particular skill. He has learned the alphabet of British tea, strong, sweet, and corrective. He knows that coffee appears in rotation and that its arrival in the mugs sets off a low murmur across the hut, the sound of a pleasure denied for too long. Numbers contrast with numbers. German domestic bread rations shrink. British camp bakeries calculate loaves per head by charts sent from the War Office. German ersatz coffee, chicory, roasted rye, acorns, becomes a symbol of shortage. British camp coffee is a symbol of capacity. This is not generosity pure and simple. It is logistics demonstrating its reach. It is the state saying to its enemy, even here, under guard, the supply line holds. The men who were captured at Neuve-Chapelle or Luce or the Somme carry their own timelines. Each has a moment when fear becomes routine. Each has a morning when the taste of the drink in his cup resets his idea of Britain, not soft but organized, not weak but rich, not indulgent but calculating. An officer class watches this from a distance. Held in separate quarters, allowed certain privileges by convention, they observe the enlisted men's rations with a mix of relief and professional curiosity. A Prussian lieutenant writes in his journal that the kitchen smells like a barracks at home, a comment as much about order as aroma. He wonders what it says about the island that its prisoners eat, while his father writes of shortages in Berlin. He notes the irony but does not press it. Officers prefer abstractions to hunger. The midpoint reveal comes not in a moment of drama, but in an audit. The International Committee of the Red Cross, emerging in this war as an inspector of camps, counts calories as a proxy for decency. It studies menus and body weights, sickness rates, and hospital returns. The inspectors do not care whether the bread is white for reasons of taste. They care whether the diet is adequate to sustain life without loss of work capacity. In Britain, they record a steadiness that surprises men who have fallen asleep with the taste of turnip on their tongues. A British quartermaster explains his approach without sentiment. He keeps two ledgers, one for what goes in, one for what goes out. He knows flour arrival dates by memory. He knows that soldiers guarding prisoners will do their work better if the prisoners are not in revolt over hunger. He knows that a hot drink in the morning lowers the temperature of 1,000 small corners of the camp day. He is building a machine that turns supplies into compliance, not mercy into gratitude. What happens next makes the pattern obvious. As Germany tightens belts at home, the British detach work groups to farms in increasing numbers. Each morning's coffee is not just a comfort, it is fuel for a national calculus. The prisoners' labor returns in turnips and hay and timber that appear in British supply lines. A cup in the hut becomes a crate on a lorry, becomes a ration tin in a trench. The chain is circular. The man who once fired at British soldiers now helps feed them by the discipline of his own survival. The numbers tell an inverse story as the war drags on. In German cities, average body weight declines. In British camps, prisoners stabilize or gain compared to their arrival. In German kitchens, coffee is a memory. In British camps, it is a rotation. And so the shock of that first mug, the one on Cannock Chase in the half-light of a September dawn, becomes a benchmark by which a prisoner measures each new loss, each new winter at home. There are moments of violence in the camps. A guard loses his temper, a prisoner refuses an order, a punishment squad marches across a yard to an iron bar. These are real, and they scar. But even on those days, the cookhouse keeps a schedule. The stove is lit, the jars are opened, the mugs are set out in rows. The smell carries across the compound and reaches the wire where men stare into the distance and imagine their streets. It is a smell that says, the machinery of the enemy is intact. By the spring of 1918, Britain finally adopts formal rationing at home. Butter, sugar, meat, each gets its day in the rota of scarcity. And yet in the camps, the bread remains white more often than not. The message is quiet, but unmistakable. The state has decided where predictability matters most. Soldiers at the front, workers in the factories, and men behind wire whose predictability is itself a public good. The war ends abruptly and slowly at once. November 11, 1918, is a date that changes everything for everyone and almost nothing in the short term for men in huts behind fences. Repatriation requires ships and trains and agreements. In the meantime, breakfast is served. And now the mugs of coffee carry a different taste, of relief, of anger, of uncertainty. The white bread is no longer a symbol of the enemy's capacity, but of the prisoner's suspended life. The inversion arrives when some prisoners, older, skilled, or simply weary, admit what they have suspected for months. They are healthier inside the British camps than their families have been at home. A man receives a letter telling him of a sister's illness, of a neighbor's death from flu on top of hunger. He looks at his heel of bread and feels a complicated guilt. He is a prisoner who eats while his town starves. He is an enemy who benefits from the rules of a war he did not choose. The thesis snaps into view in a single line. The taste of white bread in a British camp is the taste of maritime power made personal. After the armistice, the men begin to leave in drafts. Some carry with them a camp currency note as a souvenir. Some carry a cigarette tin. All carry the memory of the first morning they realized their enemy would feed them well. On the trains to ports, the countryside flashes by. hedgerows, mills, rivers that do not freeze for lack of coal. On the ships, the horizon closes and then opens onto a homeland changed by 4 winters of scarcity. What follows are consequences measured not in the shouts of politics, but in the soft lines of family kitchens. Men return and speak in unexpected tones about the enemy, not affection, not gratitude, but recognition. The system that fed them is the same system that starved their neighbors. This does not create forgiveness, it creates comprehension. And comprehension is a quiet detonator. It explodes propaganda by replacing it with concrete images: a mug in a hut, a loaf on a rack. In Germany, the post-war years are tight. Reparations debates and demobilization feed an economy that lurches. The memory of white bread in captivity becomes a story told at tables where bread is again scarce, then again plentiful, then again devalued by inflation until a loaf costs paper by the armful. The old soldier in the story does not sentimentalize it. He uses it to explain a world in which the flow of goods dictates the fate of men. Not heroism, not hatred, but shipping schedules and harvests and who controls the ports. In Britain, veterans become policemen, clerks, foremen. Guards who once counted heads under tin roofs remember the simple proofs of a camp that ran on time: coffee before roll call, bread before work, tea after muster. They do not call it benevolence. They call it procedure. They file the memory with 1,000 other routines that kept a complicated war from fraying entirely at the edges. In kitchens across both countries, new habits take hold. In Germany, ersatz coffee lingers as a taste of necessity. It never quite leaves the cupboards of those who learn to make do. In Britain, white bread remains an emblem of normalcy, even as nutritionists begin to argue for whole meal on health grounds in later decades. The meanings flip, then flip again. But the memory of the contrast, the sudden, almost indecent riches of a prisoner's breakfast, does not fade. A few captured men write memoirs. Most do not. Their stories enter the bloodstream of families as anecdotes, half-remembered and told in the quiet voice reserved for things that matter but do not fit narratives of glory. They gave us real coffee, a father tells a son who now drinks tea in a post-war kitchen, and the bread was white. No more detail is needed. The son understands that the enemy's strength can be tasted. He learns that wars are won by people who can heat water on time. The memory also works in reverse. For British listeners, these stories become evidence that their country behaved decently. There is truth in that. There is also calculation. Feeding prisoners well prevents riots and propaganda disasters. Feeding them well converts them into reliable labor when the nation is short of hands. The moral and the practical are not opponents in this story. They are partners wearing the same uniform. Place names from the camp era fade on modern maps. Hut lines become grassy rectangles in aerial photographs. Small cemeteries on British soil bear German names in neat stone, a reminder that not every captive went home. Museum displays assemble mugs, ration cards, cookhouse ladles, and a baker's cap in a glass case under careful light. Visitors read captions and move on. They do not smell the coffee. They do not touch the bread. The sense memory is locked in the past with the men who carried it. But the meaning is not locked. It remains relevant whenever nations decide how to treat enemies in their hands. The rule that emerges from the ledger of that war is simple. Predictable rations produce predictable behavior. Dignity at the level of a meal enables control at the level of a camp. If you doubt it, count the mornings when a hot drink averted an argument, when a slice of bread ended a complaint. The daily microeconomics of food turned a mass of captives into a manageable workforce and kept them from becoming a revolt. Return to the hut on Cannock Chase. The rain has stopped. The sky outside is the gray of a uniform washed too many times. The German private finishes his coffee. He eats the last piece of bread slowly, not as a treat but as a calculation, how long until the next. He hears the whistle for roll call and rises with the others. He is not free. He is not content. But he is fed, and that fact rearranges the furniture in his mind. Not through pity, but through planning. Not through kindness, but through capacity. Not through mercy alone, but through a web of ships, mills, railways, and ledgers that begin far from the wire and end at a long table where a man sits with a mug in his hands and understands that his enemy governs by schedule. The end comes when the men go home. The bread at the quay is brown again. The coffee at the station is thin. The lessons remain. A nation that can serve white bread and hot coffee to its prisoners has declared something fundamental about itself and about its means. It has said, even here, especially here, we will run the machine. And so the tale resolves with a quiet image, steam rising from a cup in a wooden hut, a contrast that doubled as a weapon. War, stripped of slogans, is often this: stomachs, not speeches; menus, not manifestos. The soldier lifts his mug, the guard shouts, the line moves. The world beyond the wire continues to burn down and rebuild itself. Inside for a moment, there is only the taste of coffee and the soft give of white bread under a hungry thumb.